Art School 7. Art School 7. Physical form. When drawing forms, think in terms of angles and planes, not in terms of cliché. Concentrate on changes of direction to solidity of form. Here's where measurement comes in. Use the analytical. Gauge angles and lengths. Gauge your angles and lengths. However, one must also bear in mind the synthetic. Such things as perspective, the governance of certain sets of rules concerning things as foreshortening and shading and highlight. It's not so much the shape we represent in the drawing as the form. The work of art is, in this respect, like a recreating of what is depicted in the representational style. It isn't as though the artist is copying what is being drawn or painted, but rather what is done in the work is a way of assembling what is being represented by the work of art. It's a kind of constructing process in which the artist, by the act of creativity in representationalism, is assembling the thing observed in his or her work of art. This is why it's useful to study physical objects such as statuary. This becomes a virtual exercise in assisting the artist to get a grasp of what needs to unfold in the process of representational drawing or painting, which everyone must do at least a bit of to grasp essentials. It helps because you can then get away from the cold representation of only what is seen, a copy of the image sensed on one's retina, as it were, but rather, by getting involved with the volume of the actual form, it helps the artist to get a better concept of representing form in his or her work. It helps one to get a sense of the structure of the subject of the work. It even helps to handle the statue or objects in the still life, in that it better helps to convey in the artwork the sense of the tactile, the plano-angular, altidirectional, analysynths. It's like having trouble pronouncing my own words. Analysynths, recrofacto, tenio assemblage, and visio appendization, synretinoidally structuri. A form becomes plano-angular. A form becomes a plano-angular altidirectional, or a plano-angular altidirectional. A drawing of it becomes either a mere cliché, or ideally an analysynthal recrofacto which has the qualities of being tenio-assembleric, visio-appendic, and synretinoidally structuralic.
Give me a drink on that one, buddy. Oh, shit.
Structuralic, how do you pronounce that? Oh. All right. Sin spect realit plans spatialin neo point sin descript tenio transversoblique mergon. The Cubist movement built upon form in a departure from the artifice of the conventions of painting, of depicting a scene from reality. They simplified the rules of perspective and so on, using only one-point perspective. The subject matter was to appear as if lit during the daytime instead of the more complicated lighting sometimes achieved in the studio by earlier artists such as Ingres, David, or Rembrandt. They shared ideas that often occur in circles of artists from time to time, that of the possibility of portraying alternate existences to that which occurs in the real world. But in order to do so, they would have to simplify things, at least at first. And they must have realized that the result would appear bizarre and facile to those unaware of what they were trying to do. But the result would be a legitimate part of reality, and in fact, an addition to it. And after all, adding to reality instead of merely copying it is the true vocation of the creative artist. In art history, such as the so-called Rococo period, art had served a function of freezing views of the real world in a romanticized way onto a picture plane in a highly stylized and elaborate manner. But eventually in the 19th century, coming to the realization that art would now have to go beyond into more than a presentation of mastery of technique, artists like Courbet and then Cézanne began to work outside the envelope of mere skill in the application of style. As if a great equation was being solved throughout history as mankind graduated from depiction of superstition and idols, and then got out of the rut of having to cater to religious patrons who wanted pictures of themselves kneeling with saints as public relations stunts for the folks back home. Finally, after art progressed to the depiction of reality itself in landscape and portraiture, artists began to bump into a vast glass ceiling. This is not gender specific, although yeah, the gender did play a part, except for what's his name, Cassatt and a few other ladies. It was mostly men that did the artwork. Don't ask me why, but anyway, the equation was solved. There was nowhere else to go with it, and anything they did further would be repeating history, which is what the contemporary realists of the early 21st century are doing, because they're just getting bought off by gas-guzzling, got-rich-quick, airhead hustlers who know nothing about art except that it, in their stilted, plebeian opinion, merely copy reality. Fortunately for all of us, Paul Cézanne had a good dad, wealthy enough to give him a place to work and a grub stake, because at that time a lot of other artists were dying off by causes related to malnutrition, and we lost them before they could really get somewhere. In order to get beyond, they would have to endure quite a bit of rejection and often deadly privation. Ironically, today, their canvases are each worth a fortune, and some cannot be bought at any price. Not because of greatness of their achievement, but because art, particularly done by someone of note, if it passed the magic 100-year mark, becomes the ultimate of antiques, a fine art antique. A bit of actual art history for you there. So Cézanne could then go ahead and start crossing a few barriers, and he did. People criticized him because he often took so very long to complete a canvas. Often, when doing still lifes, he would take so long that he'd include the withering of the fruit and vegetables in the scene. He had come out of the school of the Impressionists, as others had, such as Gauguin, who worked on flattening and abstracting the image, Van Gogh, who expanded into passion and expressionism, and others who skirted the borders, such as the primitive artist Henri Rousseau. So the equation began so long ago with the advent of the Florentine and Sienese schools, with Giotto and Cimabue, and then the Renaissance, so-called, and the advent of the classical artists had run its course by the 19th century, when the Impressionists arguably took it to its last extreme. Now, in computer-generated art, we understand that the application of the technique of Impressionism is really more like the filters we use to portray a subject in an entirely different way. Human beings, too, can master these quote-unquote filters in a way, and if so, then possibly the Renaissance tradition can be carried out in thousands of different other ways. So then, as the Cubists saw, sure, you could have variety. How quaint. But variety was not progress. So, up to now, it hasn't happened. Well, one day, this Spanish kid, Pablo Picasso, picked up a fabulous, wild, unabashed, and sort of garish painting in the Paris flea market, cheap. He got round to actually meeting Henri, who became a big influence on him and probably helped him out of his melancholy blue and rose periods. I don't know how much influence Pablo's dad had on him, but he was a professional artist, doing sort of lovely paintings on a rooftop, mostly of pigeons, such as with pigeons as subject matter in subdued mauves and grayish tones. There was also a sense of melancholy that Pablo was in a way emulating. But then, perhaps with the help of Rousseau, he perked up with his friend. He perked up, and don't forget the conjunction. We're at Conjunction City here. And with his friend Juan Gris and others began to simplify the work, take it back to square one, so to speak. Thus freed up, they could expand in another direction away from perfectionism and style and begin to penetrate that glass ceiling of old-timey Renaissance chutzpah. Now, you have to realize that it's possible for the collector to get hustled here. You know, a lot of fakes could then penetrate the art world, you know, and set up a slapdash racket and get rich off the patrons who grabbed anything abstract just for the prestige of being way out, cool, hip, avant-garde, and a bunch of other social things that have nothing to do with art. That's probably why those movements seem to have died out, and museums just aren't what they used to be, even though they've got the same sorts of stuff in them. It's simple. Spot the hustlers, bypass them, then bring in the real artists breaking the barriers, or you'll fade out with the relics of the past. By the late 20th century, art went the way of the Rockwell and the Wyeth dynasty of flaky, moody realism, or worse, slumped into the macabre with an army of black-suited in-crowd cliques doing realistic horror pictures. As you can tell by now, I'm not very impressed. They'll probably slump back into the use of stylism to produce photo-sharp tripe of the old Bronze Age idol stuff, realistic scenes of somebody's idea of the earth springing forth from the hair from the armpit of the great Yeti, or something idiotic. And they go back to their religious stuff. You know, hey, you know, you depict it like that, it's not a belief system anymore. Many mocked Rousseau as a primitive, especially with his fondness for invention and inclusion of the exotic in his work. But the effect was to achieve a sense of realism, all the while completely ignoring visual convention by means of his characteristically unabashed lack of sophistication, while leaning almost totally towards factualism. The palm tree was going to be in there no matter what. The lion was going to sniff the dreamer in the desert nocturnal scene, even if realism were to suffer a bit. The Cubists began to work on a conscious, concerted effort to break free and begin to work on something new, just as the Renaissance artists had broken away from their past. But now, it must be in a radically different way. They elected, among other things, to try to do away with perspective while still incorporating spatiality into the composition. Of course, now you know it's all history, art history, and so the academicians got in there with their fol de rol, or as the French go, folie du roi, the folly of the king, and superfluous verbiage. So we don't know that much about what really happened. At least I don't. Maybe there are some personal diaries and journals out there somewhere that someone kept somehow. They did seem to be sort of meticulous. My impression is that after a while those boys were just having a good time, having a good time with it. And that's the way with artists when they really get into their work. By and large, they were really on to something. But you have to remember Picasso was in the movement, and he was a sheer genius. That guy could have made anything work. You know, the funny part is to watch the scholars try to explain Cubism the way they used to, with all the hype and technique of babble and verbiage, and went on during the pre-impressionist era with all their usual vernacular. You know, Picasso was a threat to them because they couldn't explain him away. If you ever had the real story of art history, it would have been a heck of a lot more interesting than all that filler the scholars used to describe, everything, and they used it to describe technique. If you go by scholarship, no wonder these guys are coming up with this stilted crap. They're depending on scholars for their information. I used to say, just don't trust a scholar anywhere any further than you could throw him. But more accurately, is don't trust a scholar any more than he or she could throw his or her voice. Okay. And it's like instead of a viceroy, it would be a voiced row. Okay. Sure, there was some technique, but a lot of it was the genius and personality of the artist. In a way, the academicians, really, killed a lot of fine art with their inflated and hypothetical jargon. They made it more and more impossible to get recognized enough to make a living at art. Actually, my favorite cubist was Georges Braque. Yeah, that's how you pronounce it. Maybe it's Brock, There's no C-H-E there, I guess. Georges Braque. But not because of his fabulous breakthrough so much, but because of his unique and characteristic work. No matter the technique, the personality of the artist shines through. That sets the genuine apart from the fake. The real artist's work is recognizable without even having to check the signature. Then the others come up with elaboration on technique and fill they fill their textbooks, and the weaker artists, swallow that stuff and resort to trying to mimic the masters. The reason, I can't do this subject justice. The reason why a great artist seems to handle a composition in the same way each time isn't as much due to technique as it is the essence of the personality of the individual. It's like, what kind of technique do you do to sign a check? And yet they're using that signature to say that is you. It's your personality. Nobody, not even a forger, can actually imitate. They'll spot it eventually. Okay. So, the fabulous breakthrough is, no matter the technique, the personality of the artist shines through. That sets the genuine apart from the fake. The real artist's work is recognizable, just look at the painting. Ah, yeah, there's Braque right there. There's a couple of Braque over in the corner. Let's have a look at it. Yeah, man, George. Wow, remember George at Valley Forge? No, wrong Braque. Oh, okay. All right. Let's see. So, the reason why a great artist seems to handle a composition the same way is the personality. Okay, there comes a point in your work when you've got to stop worrying about how you're going to set about being an artist and just be one. The uniqueness in the painting isn't that much in the skill or the execution of styles, not even in a level of brilliance, but in the mystery of the unique complexity of the individual artist and the personality. Without the scholars trying to cash in and muscle their unworthy way into the art world, there would have been a much more great and fabulous art. There would have been much more great and fabulous art in the world today, and art would have played out a much greater role in human social well-being. So the academy, the academics ruined it. They destroyed art, virtually destroyed it. Maybe they helped at the beginning, because looking back, when art was based on, in a superstitious Bronze Age and stuff, it was very boring. It's like figures going like that, nothing else. The Egyptians came up with some nice stuff and mundane. I don't know. Anyway, okay. In a way, the glorification of scholarship has killed civilization in our time and destroyed art as we once knew it. Now all that is left are these filthy rich barbarians in their ticky-tacky castles demanding realistic, quote-unquote, artwork. And for those who can afford it, antique paintings a century old or greater. Oh my, must be nice. So they all got nowhere. So all they got were cheap paint magicians who pull a sunset out of a hat, and maybe the fortunate ones with their millions get some great art, but they still don't know it. The Cubists were trying to come up with something radically different. As I was pointing out earlier, there is something to be said for the surface itself that is being worked on. Before, everyone had been trying to treat the canvas or paper as a sort of window the audience was supposed to be looking through, especially when the picture frame was invented and classical art became an obsession with making the spectator imagine he or she were looking through and peering out of an aperture on the wall into a wonderful scene frozen in time. So these boys hanging out at the local cafe and so on managed one of the greatest collaborations since Impressionism. They were going to try as best they could to portray space and distance on all on the surface, as close to two dimensions as they could get. So what does that have to do with form? The form is still there, but not in the way we would work it in our art school exercises. We still need to study and use the picture plane as a sort of window into the distance. You see, in my opinion, though it was a legitimate movement and the work was valid and significant, they really didn't get to where they were headed. The rules were too stringent. Picasso continued on his own and into his own unimitatable world. And the scholars left him alone. If one got too near, he would get devoured, in a sense. Picasso would pump them and cerebrally drain all thought out of them. They would walk away semi-conscious. He was astoundingly prolific. Picasso's motto was, "When I run out of red, I use lipstick." He became so great in his own time that he once he turned a dollar bill into $100 by signing it. He would buy a villa, fill it with artwork, and then buy another and move into it. It was Villa Nova. Now, with the advent of digital art, we can begin to further explore what they might have been getting at. Showing form without the conventional rules by flattening it and all else. They achieved a spontaneity of presentation that brought the gallery back to reality by having the scenes therein depart from reality to become an addition to reality. Now, that's the quintessential argument of abstract art. See, it's an addition to reality, not a mimic of it. The portrayal of distance in the composition had to be done using a two-dimensional item, the line. They also departed from realism in their use of color as well, and thus came up with something the connoisseur would realize, if he or she were being honest to themselves, was much more fascinating to observe. They were taken out of the stifling boredom of the realists who, except for the masters among them, became disturbingly mundane. Though few would admit to it, as far as I know, maybe some did. Maybe a few would fess up and admit that they were just in it for the money. Honesty is the best policy. Some, like Daumier, who put life into his realistic pictures and prints, which he often sold on the streets as a colporteur of his own stuff, taking it from person to person to raise funds. That's, by the way, a nice way to raise funds too. And it's actually when I was in France, it was still a legitimate occupation. You could actually get a visa as a colporteur. You know, a colporteur of his own stuff, use that to raise funds in a way others would have been ashamed to do. Some, like Daumier, added life to the portrayal of reality. But you see, once an artist has command of the skills, he or she takes them somewhere. That's the beauty of it. From work like his, and perhaps Goya, or Goya, I think, that's how you pronounce it, Goya of Spain, would spring the idea of expressionism that others later would embrace, including me, but also artists known and reputable such as Munch, or Munch. I don't know how you pronounce this. I didn't rehearse. Okay, so Daumier's departure from the norm, as it were, may have been derided by the academics of his day as exaggeration. But that's the problem with thinking too logically. In fact, automatically, the skeleton changes shape under weight and stress. Automatically. Let's see. I need about 10 more cups of coffee. I need a couple of coffee. Okay. A few years ago, I could have read this with no problem. It must have been a red letter day. Okay, so let's take it from the top. That's the problem with thinking too logically. In fact, anatomically, The skeleton changes shape under weight and stress, though it may not be noticeable. Remember, the eye and the mind read a lot into the enormous flood of sensory input. What these artists were doing may have been an extension of that phenomenon, using the picture plane as an external tool to expand the capability of observation. Degas was working with this as well in his efforts to depict human form. If you ever wonder how to spell all these names, the artists, just go to my website. It's still up. I'm starting to run out of money to pay for it. But anyway, paulhallart.com. Click the art class, art school button, and then go to art school number 7 here. Degas was working on this as well with his efforts to depict human form. He had to stretch his powers of observation beyond the relaxed poses of the studio models of yesteryear. In fact, it is said he practically tortured his models, usually dancers, whom he required to pose in difficult positions for hours, which they normally would have executed in mere seconds on the dance floor. Others of the Impressionists began to emerge beyond the quote-unquote ceiling they had run into. With Claude Monet, it was color, always color. But as Pizarro said, it is possible to define form using only color. Monet was once described thus: Monet is nothing more than an eye, but what an eye. And of course, the one who arguably was the first of the Cubists, arguably was the first of the Cubists, Paul Cézanne, used shading to define geometrical form prevalent in nature. All these helped the Cubists themselves to depart completely from the norm and go all out in the search to find different ways to portray spatially, ideally in just 2 dimensions of the picture plane, the 2 dimensions of the picture plane, to create a whole new form of art never accomplished before. Braque and Picasso even began to use other shapes in the canvas besides the usual square and rectangle. Some say it's because the corners gave them problems, but I don't think so. They were, I'm sure, trying to go further than just the surface of the canvas by altering the shape of the canvas itself. Actually, the human field of vision is sort of oval anyway. Not that that had anything to do with it, but you never know. I mean, it was so long ago. Almost a century of time has gone since, by the time this article was written in October of 2004. But suffice it to say, the real artist is always looking for other ways to express form. It's as they say, how you gonna keep them down on the form after they've seen Paris? By 2011. Hey, that's now! By 2011, some of those rich airheads that hate Cubism will be trying to pay millions for a Georges Braque with letters and numbers in the composition, because by then such work will have crossed the 100-year barrier. So it's too late to get a Braque, man. The millionaires are after it because it's an antique now. It will have crossed the 100-year barrier this year, most of his work, and have become antique fine art, the king of all antiques. You're going to have to wait till summer. See, it's not quite summer yet, so you might still have time. I guess you can imagine that there's an art's future market. Instead of modern art, it's art futures, buying antique art. How twisted you get, man. Some people love that. Okay, it was that summer back in 1911 that Georges and Pablo got the idea of actually just painting flat letters and numbers into the composition at random. Braque explains that letters and numbers could not be distorted because, being themselves flat, were not in space, and thus by contrast their presence in the picture made it impossible to distinguish between objects situated in space and those which were not. It was then that calligraphic elements became used successfully for another purpose than literature, that of representing flatness, that assisted in representing space and distance while keeping the whole composition as flat as possible. That must have certainly flown in the face of intellectualism and scholarship, usurping their very tools to do other things randomly on the mute picture plane. Who says flat will get you nowhere? If you imagine it bizarre to place random letters on the picture plane, let me remind you that once the functionality of lettering was established, that was it. Humankind stopped working on their alphabets and just standardized them and forgot them. The lettering we are using in this text that I write and text we use today goes back thousands of years. Therefore, it was highly appropriate that artists would feel that they needed to represent lettering as a part of the composition. It's too bad they left it behind as a phase or old hat movement. We need to grow out of our antiquated forms of writing, and the artists can begin to get us out of that rut. But all that has been lost now, as art has digressed to a miserable and cheap form of realism in the early 20th century.